welcome. If you seek truth, the truth shall set you free. Fear not. And now the agenda with Crystal Risotti.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the agenda with Crystal Risotti. I'm the host, Crystal, and I want to welcome you here. Thanks for jumping in and watching the episode. Tonight, we're going to be talking about detransitioning from gender ideology. The title's A Change of Plans, Detrans, Part 3. So we've had 2 episodes about this already. Jumping into episode 3, I want to encourage you, if you're a follower, if you're already liking the content that you're hearing or watching, make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell, and select all so you get all the notifications. Share, comment, questions below, whatever you can throw in will help us out greatly. So I want to encourage you to do that because sharing is caring. We threw that in as a new thing. Might be adding it to the show from now on. So let's get started. In the prior episodes, we talked about detransitioning. We've had testimonies from detransitioners. I've shown you some posts from Reddit, from detrans people. We talked about the history of where everything came from, the statistics. We talked about the medical side of things. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about testimonies from detrans people because I want to dwell on this a lot. I feel like it's really important that people get a full understanding of what these people who have decided to detransition have to say. I'm a firm believer in reverse engineering things. Even at work, I'll say, what is the end game? What's the goal we're shooting for? And then I try to reverse engineer it to come up with the steps that we need to take to get there. I feel like we have the benefit now of people who have detransitioned to give us insight into what they've experienced. And my prayer and hope is that it prevents other people from wanting to transition in the first place. Why do I feel that way? It's not because I judge people who are or who claim to be a trans. It's not because I want to, criticize them, put them down, anything like that. What I want them to understand is what the world is telling you about yourself is the antithesis. It's the opposite of what God tells us about ourselves. That's the goal. I want you to understand how valuable you are as you are and to accept yourself as you are. It's funny because the world will flip that, and the world will take people who have transitioned and say, you don't accept me for who I am. When in actuality, and that's Satan's little tactic every single time he counterfeits, but in reality, God made you as you were at birth. He made you that way for a reason, and you have value in who you are at birth. So transitioning to something else isn't going to make you more valuable. It actually gives you less value, and again, not as a person, but in the struggles that you're going to end up having. So I want to jump in with some verses. If you've listened to the episodes previously, you have already heard these verses, but I'm going to keep drawing them in because I think they're really important to paint the picture of what biblically is taught about who we are and what we need to be doing in our lives. So let's start with slide 1. This is Romans 12:2. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. That's our whole purpose, and we can only achieve it through the transformation of our mind that God provides us. 2 Corinthians 10:5. Casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. This one's talking about, where do a lot of these ideas start? Imagination, right? This is telling you to control your imagination. This is telling you to control yourself in your thoughts so that you're not thinking things and entertaining them that are against what God created. Philippians 2:5 says, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus." And this verse I used to say, I'm pretty sure that Jesus would want us to be accepting of ourselves as in the way that God created us. Jesus never talked about transitioning, okay? Proverbs 23:7, "For as he thinketh in his heart, so is he." So what we allow ourselves to entertain in our minds is who we become. And we need to be careful with that. And then I also threw in a couple verses last time. I'm going to do it too in this one. It says, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well." And this is showing that God knew us before we were even formed in the womb. It's only by his will that we were conceived. He's in control. And so we should be giving him praise and acknowledging that we're fearfully and wonderfully made in who we are to begin with. We don't need to change that. We need to ensure that we're changing for the better as a journey to become more Christ-like. But we don't need to change our physical appearance. That's not anything of God. With that, I want to go into the communist goals. Again, if you've been listening, you've heard these. I'm going to keep drilling them in as long as we talk about this because they are very relevant to this topic. Let's go to slide 2. Communist goal 25, break down cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography and obscenity in books, magazines, motion pictures, radio, and TV. Communist goal 26, present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, and healthy. And I'm going to add to that the transition, not just homosexuality, but transitioning, gender ideology and all that, because it fits in here. It's just when these communist goals were written before 1963, that wasn't a prominent thing in society, but you could seriously, easily fit it into that communist goal. Slide 3, Communist Goal 32, support any socialist movement to give centralized control over any part of the culture, meaning education, social agencies, welfare programs, mental health clinics, etc. We see that happening through the control in the psychiatric industry. And slide 4, Goal 39, dominate the psychiatric profession and use mental health laws as a means of gaining coercive control over those who oppose communist goals. Now, in order to define that as those who oppose communist goals, you have to look at the holistic view of all the communist goals. There's 45. Essentially, it's anybody who opposes what we're seeing going on now, because again, they've had decades to put these plans into place to destroy our culture, and that is what the communist goal is. So we see this happening. I want to start off with an interview between Jordan Peterson and Chloe Cole. If you don't know who Jordan Peterson is, he was a tenured professor in Canada who was going against the grain of popular science, I should say, because I'm not going to really call it science. It's popular culture. And because of that, he was given the ultimatum to either go to re-education training in order to fit in and change his position and his worldview, or leave. So he has since become part of, what's it called, Josh? Daily Wire. Yes, thank you. Forgot. Thank you, Josh. He's become part of Daily Wire, and he has a podcast series that I love to watch. He's intelligent. He's very He's very basic about the way that he puts things and the way he believes. And he's not a Christian. I'm not going to claim that yet. He's been making headway towards that little by little. So we're praying for that. But he's really good if you want to dive into somebody who's incredibly intelligent. And Chloe Cole is a detransitioner who was transitioned at 13 medically. At 15, had a double mastectomy and decided to detransition at 16. So let's go ahead and watch a little bit of the interview between Jordan Peterson and Chloe.
At the age of 12, I started experiencing some gender dysphoria, and I started seeing a therapist, and I got the diagnosis, and I started going on the path of medical transition at the age of 13, starting with blockers and then moving on to hormones. And at 15, I got a double mastectomy, but it turned out that it wasn't the best decision for me, and I stopped transitioning at the age of 16.
Okay, so let's go back to when you were 12. Well, about when did you hit puberty?
I had a fairly early puberty. Actually, I started developing at around the age of 9, if not a little bit earlier.
Okay, and so at 9, do you remember if that changed you emotionally?
Yeah, it did. It was really difficult for me, actually.
Okay, so let me give you a little background. You tell me if anybody's ever told you this before, okay? So boys and girls before puberty experience approximately the same levels of negative emotion. So that would be primarily anxiety and emotional pain, or even sometimes susceptibility to physical pain. And emotions like frustration and disappointment and shame and guilt and self-consciousness are all part of that, what would you call it, network of negative emotion. Now, what happens to girls when they hit puberty, and no one knows exactly why this is that their negative emotion levels go up. And so that on average, women, biologically mature women, are more sensitive to negative emotion than biologically mature men. And that kicks in at puberty. Now, there's a variety of explanations for that, but no one knows for certain. And here's some of them. Okay, so first of all, sexual dimorphism and physical strength really emerges at puberty. So boys and girls are pretty evenly matched physically, but once puberty kicks in, boys are taller, stronger, heavier, and they're much stronger in terms of upper body strength. So women are at a disadvantage physically in relationship to anything that might have to do with physical combat. And so on those grounds, it makes sense for women to be somewhat more sensitive to threat.
I love that he puts it in those terms, that women are just more sensitive to threat, and it's because of the physical changes that occur at puberty. I've said it before, I'm going to say it again. Nobody I know enjoyed puberty. Nobody likes it. It can be very devastating for some people, depending on, what's happened in your life before that. And so I get why some people are then pushed or gravitate towards the transition lifestyle. I get that more and more as I do more research following detrans people. I understand it more. The other thing he talked about, though, was, did you catch the emotional side of it? So with females at the time of puberty, negative emotions increase. He talks a little bit, and I don't think we have this included in this in these clips that we're going to play, but he does talk a little bit about how girls become so consumed with body image at puberty. And that was one of the problems with Chloe. And you might hear her speak about that later. She ended up thinking that she was never going to look like a Kardashian, so she might as well become a trans boy because she was never going to measure up as the stereotypical female image. That's something that is part of that negative emotions part of puberty for girls. And so I think it's really important to highlight those differences that do occur naturally, because those are triggers for this lifestyle to change. Let's go to the next part.
Okay, so then another explanation is that women are more vulnerably sexually than men because they bear a much higher cost for reproduction, obviously, with pregnancy and protracted dependence of infants. And so they're more vulnerable on the sexual front, so it makes sense for them to be more sensitive to any threat that's associated with sexual activity.
Mm-hmm. At the time of puberty hitting, I don't think we're aware of that. I don't think that it's obvious to us or conscious to us about our responsibility in the childbearing framework or in the child rearing capacity. I really don't think that's something that's consciously there for most of us, but I do think it is something that is subconsciously there and naturally there. Let's go to the next part.
And then the third explanation, and there may be more, is that women are charged, generally speaking, with the primary responsibility for infants. And infants are extremely dependent and vulnerable. And so you could make a case that adult women's nervous systems are actually adapted for the mother-child dyad and not for the, say, emotional well-being of the individual woman. And a woman needs to be threat sensitive because she's going to be taking care of infants and extremely dependent children. And it makes sense for her to be more cognizant of threats as a consequence, even though the negative consequence of that for women and all of this is that women are much more likely to suffer from depression and anxiety than men.
So a few things that I have thoughts about on this section. One is that, historically, when gender transition became available, it was mostly boys transitioning to girls. Now it has switched and there's more girls transitioning to males. I think part of that has to do with this. If you think about, the nature of mankind, we've had men being the hunters and women being the gatherers. That's just how it works. Well, when you're a gatherer, you're very careful about what you're gathering for food, for your family. You're probably slower at things. As a hunter, you have to be quick on things. You have to be reactionary. You see something, you have to go for it. With gathering, it's a slower process. And so by nature, I think women are that way. That is part of this natural occurrence at puberty too. I think that by taking on the responsibility for infants, having that as a subconscious thought process and being that gatherer type of personality as opposed to a hunter personality, it can be more devastating, I think, to be thinking through, that responsibility during puberty, taking that all on. Again, I don't necessarily think it's a conscious thing. I think it's a subconscious thing. I think it's just the way we're made. And I think that is in the back of our minds. So I don't know. I'm not an expert by any means, but that's what I'm taking away from a lot of the research I've seen and a lot of the things I've watched with Jordan and with other detrans people in the interviews I've seen. Let's go to the next part.
Growing up, I was a bit of a tomboy and also on the spectrum. And I didn't know this until I was diagnosed just last year, but it did play a role in my socialization and my difficulty getting along with other girls growing up. And I found that I fit in more with the boys. And when I hit puberty, it was a bit earlier than most of my peers, and I got taller than them. And
Oh, yeah.
I could keep up with the boys then, and I had a lot of pride in that. But as the years went on, they started to get taller than me and outmatch me physically, and this did bring on a bit of distress for me. And as I got older, socialization began to become more sex oriented, and I found it even harder to fit in with girls my age. But at the same time, I was also starting to notice there was a divide between me and boys in several ways. And there was a lot of loneliness for me, because on one hand, I didn't really feel like I was one of the girls, but on the other hand, I was losing my connection with some of my friends who I was close with and really, really cared about.
So in this case with Chloe, we've talked about this before. There is more and more of a link being drawn between people on the autism spectrum disorder and transitioning or wanting to transition to another gender. That is so critical to me, because and I haven't talked about my personal situation, but I do have a personal situation with this, and that is clearly part of it as well. I just see it as a growing snowball in the information that we do have. And again, there's very few studies being done on detrans people or following people through detransition. But there are more and more popping up because I think people are waking up and understanding the need to gather that information and to do that study work. So Chloe clearly has an autism connection. She's on the autism spectrum. She didn't know that until recently, mind you. And I believe at this point she's 22. So she recently found that out. So all that time she was going through puberty and all these changes were happening, she had no idea. But the way autism works, you do have a different way of thinking than what's considered normal, although I think it's incredibly cool the way that people who have autism think. I can relate to a lot of it myself. And it's very methodical. It's very black and white, process oriented, but also a lot of creativity thrown in as well. That is prime for looking into the possibility of gender transition. It's a draw to it. She talked about her social skills, lack thereof, and the changes that were occurring. Before puberty, she was able to compete with boys and play with them and had fun with them and was on par with them and bigger than other girls her age. So she was more drawn to the boys. And then when puberty hit, everything changed. They got bigger. She could no longer compete with them. Yet she didn't feel like she fit with the girls either because she was a tomboy. So to me, that is just a normal part of puberty. Like, I don't see that as unique. I think sometimes we as humans make things harder than they have to be. We do it all the time. We make it more complicated and more complex. And we become consumed with the ideas when we don't need to be. But that led to a lot of loneliness for her. There's another video. It's actually the full video of the interview with Chloe. This one is called The Wounds That Won't Heal. And I want to jump to that one, and we're gonna watch a little more of what Chloe has to say.
Yeah, that's utterly appalling. Yeah. You know, I've been embarrassed for years to be a member of the Intellectual Academy under the current conditions that universities, what would you say, have put themselves into. And I'm equally embarrassed to be part of the therapeutic community to hear a story like yours. It's absolutely appalling what happened to you. There's no excuse whatsoever for it. It's such a dereliction of responsibility that it's almost unimaginable. So it's really too bad that you weren't listened to in a lot more detail and with a lot more care, you know, because what you went through, it's not that abnormal. You know, everything you told me about your unhappiness as a teenager, the fact that you were isolated in middle school, the fact that you had some doubts about your developing identity. It's like, yeah, that's pretty much par for the course for adolescents. Some kids get through it with a little less scarring than others, but most adolescents have a pretty damn miserable time for about 3 years. And so the fact that led you down a path to hormonal transformation and then surgery, and that adults aided and abetted this, you know, I have some sympathy for your parents, because when parents are told, you better support your child or it'll be suicide, it's like, well, that backs them into a corner. But the medical professionals and the counselors who dealt with you, that their negligence borders, their negligence, it doesn't just border on the criminal, it crosses the boundary as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so now you're set, you go off to see a specialist. Who's the specialist and how do they treat you?
It's important to note that, I mean, it absolutely was negligence, because not only was I given surgery for a problem that was psychological in nature, in the months before that, that was when I had been diagnosed with depression and social anxiety, and when my suicidal ideation started happening. I would, at the beginning, they told my parents, like, your child will be at risk of suicide if you don't affirm her identity. But it wasn't until after I started the treatments that I started feeling like committing suicide.
So much to say about this clip. Number one, I want to highlight the fact that Jordan speaks about this crossing the line of being criminal activity. What the adults in Chloe's life did, medical professionals, like he said, he doesn't really blame the parents so much because they're depending on the medical professionals, but what they're doing is criminal activity. I get so passionate about it because I absolutely agree with that. I think it's abusive, it's exploitive. We are totally unsure of the long-term effects of this because it's only really been popular for the past few years. It's become really popular really fast, and we don't have any long-term data to demonstrate what the long-term effects are. There are a couple people like Walt Hauser that we talked about. There's another guy, I forget his name, but they transitioned many, many years ago. They speak on it. And one of them stayed trans. Walt did not. And you kind of have to be objective and listen to both their stories and determine what's right. But I'll tell you one thing they both share, that is that you should not be doing this to kids. Kids are not prepared enough to make a life decision like this. And that is becoming more and more the message, which is why the European countries are actually pulling back. But it took a lawsuit to kick that off for an investigation to happen. I'm sick of it here. I'm sick of the push for it. I'm sick of the to me, abuse of kids, the exploitation of kids to prove a point. This is a human experiment. That's all there is to it. It's a human experiment. It's a big old human experiment that's happening globally. We don't know the repercussions of it, and we'll talk about that when we talk about WPATH a little bit later. That backs it up. They say it basically themselves. So the other thing is, I want you to note Chloe's sorrow in the fact that she wasn't suicidal until she started the hormone therapies. And I'm seeing that a lot too in the detrans threads on Reddit and the interviews with detrans people. They're saying the same thing. A lot of similarities there. They don't have suicidal tendencies going into this. They have them after the fact. And to hear the horror stories on Reddit, I talked about some in the last episode. There's plenty more I could cover. That would take hours of a show in and of itself. But they're horror stories of their struggles after the fact. Nobody's listening to that. Nobody in the professional field is paying attention to that. We're starting to have people like Jordan Peterson, who is, I would consider to be an expert, but we're starting to have some people start to speak out that matter, that are credentialed, but very few and far between. And it seems like the U.S. is on a hell-bent mission to push all the way forward with this as much as possible, as quickly as possible. It's infuriating because who's suffering? These kids, these young adults. That's who's suffering. Are we really going to allow that to happen to them? Who are we as a society? I'm sorry, I get really fired up about it. Let's look at the next clip, please.
I felt like a monster.
And you were starting to think about having kids at that point. And so why? What do you think that was triggered by the surgery? Like what switched you?
I think it was most of that class. I mean, I was learning a lot about myself and also about parenting and about children. And that was when I realized, like, I think I want to have kids someday. And, I started really thinking about it, like, not only about how it relates to having lost my breasts, but also, my fertility might be affected by having to start testosterone so young.
And do you know whether that is the case now? Have you been tested in any manner that indicates whether the blockers and the testosterone have interfered with your fertility?
I don't know. I mean, by the time that I started, I did start having periods, but I was so young by that point. They weren't regular. I was only having about 3 to 4 per year. That was also another source of stress for me about being a woman.
Right,
it was
right.
it was scary. Like all the other girls my age would talk about like how, they got theirs every month or every 2 months. And, I learned it's a myth now, but they would talk about how like their cycles would supposedly sync with like family members or friends. And I was like, why isn't that happening to me? And so it was just another thing that piled that made me feel like I was broken. Luckily after stopping,
Right.
Luckily, after stopping, about 2 months later, I got my period back, and it's been surprisingly quite regular since. I don't know if I went through some development.
Oh, well, that's a good sign.
That is a good sign.
Right. Well, that's a good sign. That must be a relief, so to speak.
But I mean, there's so many other factors that play into that. I haven't been able to get tested, and I'm just not really sure of what's to come. But
Yeah.
I'm hoping.
If this doesn't infuriate you, there's something wrong with you. I'm going to say it. So I have some thoughts about this. So Chloe took a child psychology class in college and started to realize she wanted to have children. Okay, so she was in her early 20s, I believe, at that point. And that's when she realized, I take that back, it was in high school. That's when she started to realize the implications of what she had done, which made her then feel broken. What has society been pushing for years now? And we talked about this in earlier episodes. Sex ed. They want to do it younger and younger and younger. We talked about sex ed with Alfred Kinsey, John Money with the gender ideology. What did Alfred Kinsey believe? Alfred Kinsey believed that children are sexual from birth. Okay? That is the justification because that became curriculum in colleges and universities globally. His beliefs, his sexual behavior in the human male and sexual behavior in the human female books became curriculum. So we've got generations of people who have been taught that kids are sexual from birth. Okay, a couple of things about that. Number one, if kids are sexual from birth, then doesn't that mean they can consent? Where do you think the pedophilia is going to come from? We have people already pushing for that to be accepted into the alphabet soup now too. They want in. They're calling them MAPs instead of pedophiles, minor attracted persons. There's a societal push to accept pedophilia now. That is one thing. Another thing is it has driven the push from the educational systems to teach sex ed younger and younger. And the excuse I've heard is, well, kids are becoming active younger and younger. Technically, Chloe started puberty at 9. So I get that in a way. But I'm pretty sure that mentally a 9-year-old doesn't have the capacity to think about sex topics. I just am guessing. Unless you plant that stuff in their head. You plant those seeds in their head. What have I been saying? What kids are exposed to are seeds that get planted. And then they entertain those thoughts, right? They turn into thoughts, they entertain those thoughts, and that can turn into actions. We're now seeing the fruit of all these seeds that have been planted with these kids at very young ages. We talked about the genderbread, man. That is gender ideology, and it is being given to preschoolers. Do you understand that? They're starting that training with preschoolers. This is what we're reaping. You reap what you sow. I can't even imagine being Chloe, young 20s. Now If she had just been left alone, she would have arrived at all these conclusions on her own with no damage done. But because we had, as a society, to push kids into gender transitioning, oh, you're a tomboy, you must be a boy. And we rush them forward through all that and do hormone therapies with them, puberty blockers and surgeries on them. They come out on the other end in their 20s, and then they look back and go, what did you do to me? And rightly so. Now she has no way to pursue the life that she really wanted to have. Is that fair to a child? No. Let's look at the next clip, please.
Why the hell do you think it made itself manifest as a desire when you were 16? Like, do you think you knew that you were really like on the cutting edge in some sense? You know, that if you kept pushing this, you were really going to sacrifice your ability to have kids? Or what do you think produced the realization?
I think, I already had my guard down by that point, because this was around when COVID hit and there were all the restrictions put into place, and I was basically doing online school only, and I had a lot of isolation from the outside world, and this caused me a significant amount of stress, but it also allowed for a lot more time to be alone and reflect, and so it opened up my mind a little bit. And
So what were you fantasizing about on the family front when you were looking forward into the future? You were thinking about having, did you have some idea of how many kids you wanted to have? Did you have some idea about the marriage or the family structure? What was making itself manifest in your fantasy?
When I started, I was so young that I wasn't even thinking about all of that yet. But as the years passed and I started to think about like my adulthood, what I wanted to do as an adult, that thought started to pop into my head a little bit more. I never really thought about it very much until I learned about child psychology and just being a parent. I think I would have naturally had that realization if I knew more about parenting and family.
Hey,
if she knew more about it. So that goes to my point earlier. We have all these sex ed classes, right, that we're starting younger and younger. I know forms of it are given to elementary school kids. Maybe not the full on sex ed, but they introduce them to sexual concepts at an early age in elementary school. The gender ideology in preschool, which seems a little backwards, and I'm pretty sure they have to do a little bit of both to get the kids there. But she went through all this training. I'm tired of people saying education is the key. Education has not stopped teen pregnancies. Okay? We've had it for years. Has it improved it? Not really. Education was not given to Chloe about things that actually mattered, about the family structure, about childbearing, about that kind of thing. It seems like the comprehensive sex ed that's taught now is just about the act of sex. It's not about the consequences necessarily, although they mention it, but they don't go into detail about anything that can come from it. And they don't talk to him about the family structure. And even her parents clearly weren't really doing that with her. So it was almost like she had to come to these conclusions and arrive at them herself on her own. How did she do that? When COVID hit, she was alone a lot and she started to do a lot of thinking. Another thing she said, thoughts popped into her head. Those are seeds. She had to have been exposed to something for those thoughts to pop into her head. In this case, it was a good thing, right? But those are the seeds I keep talking about. And then she ended up entertaining those thoughts and going down the proper path at that point. She also said that she disconnected from media and social media at that point. And that's a key too, because It's almost like a TikTok challenge now to become trans. It's just swept through our society like crazy due to social media in particular, but also media, the exposure to it on TV. How many times have you seen a show and they have to throw a gay scene in, a lesbian scene, a trans scene in? It's to desensitize us to it and normalize it. That's the purpose. Okay, so they're doing that with kids too. Only at a much greater scale, I think. It's even in the cartoons. We talked about that too, with anime and manga, and that it doesn't stop there. It's in regular cartoons too. And again, the point that she would have naturally arrived at those same conclusions had she been left alone to her own devices and allowed to go through puberty normally. She wouldn't have had any interference from medical transitioning. So now I'm going to jump to Reddit, and I just want to point out the subreddit for detrans now has over 53,000 members as of today. I keep talking about Reddit and the subreddit for detrans and how I get a lot of information from it. Those members are people who have detransed or are detransing or have considered detransing. And so it's first person accounts from them. I think it's really important to go there. I'm just going to give you some of the highlights that I found in there. They're talking about social suicide. They're talking about it being social suicide. That was a quote from one person who posted. Social suicide being transitioning, not detrans, but transitioning was social suicide. You hear them talk about dead names too. You've probably heard that term. When somebody transitions, their old name becomes their dead name. Well, isn't that ironic that transitioning becomes a form of social suicide according to a detransitioner, and we call it a dead name? Do you see the connection? It's sad. Only in this case, because it's not a physical suicide, they come out on the other side of it and they killed themselves, and now they have to deal with that. It's crazy to me. I shouldn't use the word crazy. I don't mean that literally. I just mean it's strange to me. Another detransitioner thread talked about how they no longer trust doctors. And I could totally understand that. If our whole medical practice, our medical industry just affirms we're using the gender affirming care, which let's think about that. Is it really gender affirming? It's not. But do you see the games they play with the names and the titles of things? Gender affirming care is transitioning, which is not affirming the gender that they were born with. It's tricky. They get so tricky with stuff. But anyways, if they're pushing these kids into trans therapies or, whatever, based on a 15-minute interview in many cases with Chloe, you didn't see this part, but she does talk about how she had no evaluation. There was no psych evaluation whatsoever. Then no wonder they no longer trust doctors. They call the detrans process the, quote, dark night of the soul, unquote, period of detoxing with a cloud of physical and mental anguish. They talk about weeks and months of crying. They talk about struggles figuring out what to do with the damage they've done. Anger with parents and adults who didn't provide any counsel or resistance. Again, if you're not mad about this, something's wrong. You need to do some more research or something, because this is infuriating to me as to what we're doing to our society. There's so much destruction. Luckily, the detrans population is growing and they're seeing it on the other side, but unfortunately the damage is already done. So it's sad to me. So let's talk about who's behind all of this. There's an organization called WPATH. You might have heard of it. It stands for the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. And they are the leading resource that schools and professionals look to for standards in regard to gender ideology. So WPATH is the master organization. They have EPATH for Europe, US PATH for the US, and at this point in the US, there's 2,971 members in the US PATH group. And then they have Asia PATH for Asia Pac. They came up with what they call standards of care, and right now we're on SOC 8, so standard of care 8. I want to show you some things that they talk about themselves. Let's go to slide 5. All right, in this, they're talking about their mission and vision. They say that it was formerly known as Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association. It's a 501c3 nonprofit, interdisciplinary professional and educational organization devoted to transgender health. They go on to say their professionals supporting and student members engage in clinical and academic research, which I find so funny because they never mention detrans in here once. They do academic research to develop evidence-based medicine and strive to promote a high quality of care for transsexual, transgender, and gender nonconforming individuals internationally. They're funded primarily through the support of their membership and through donations and grants sponsored by non-commercial sources. Their mission says to promote evidence-based care, education, research, public policy, and respect in transgender health. And they go on to say their vision. We envision a world where people of all gender identities and gender expressions have access to evidence-based healthcare, social services, justice, and equality. All right. So I'm going to stop there for a second. A few things. When they talk about clinical research, what are they talking about? Who's the clinical research being done by? And when they talk about evidence-based medicine, what are they talking about? Because there are studies, like I said, Europe is ahead of us in performing studies on detrans people and publishing their findings, which is damaging to transgenderism. When they talk about evidence-based medicine, they talk about clinical research. We saw this with the pandemic, the plandemic. There was a cohort of scientists that were on one side of the aisle, and there was a cohort of scientists on the other side of the aisle, but we weren't allowed to hear from these guys on this side of the aisle. We were only allowed to hear from the people on this side of the aisle. They considered whatever these scientists were saying as misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, whatever the term was of the day. So they wanted to control the narrative, and we all had to just follow along with it. And what happened after that? The truth came out and was exposed, and they were wrong. The guys over here that were resistant to it were the ones that were right. All right. So understand this. I have over 30 years in pharmaceutical trials. I can speak to this from an educated standpoint. When they talk about clinical research, they're going to make it say what they want it to say. All right. And they're going to hide the things they don't want out there. They're going to make naysayers look like idiots, misinformation, disinformation. They're lying about things. That's not true. You have to have objectivity and look at both sides and make an educated decision based on the evidence. Okay? Both sides. Anybody worth anything in science knows you have to be objective and look at both sides, but WPATH does not want to do that. They only want to acknowledge the ones that are supporting their agenda. I'm telling you that. The other thing, when they talk about, first of all, international, so there's the global aspect, they mention justice and equality. Those are social justice warrior buzzwords. Okay, so just know social justice warriors are usually never conservatives. They're progressives, and they want to progress us right into, hell, I think. But anyways, keep that in mind. And then they go on to talk about their goals and tasks. As an international interdisciplinary professional organization, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH, will work to further the understanding and treatment of gender dysphoria by professionals in medicine, psychology, law, social work, counseling, psychotherapy, family studies, sociology, anthropology, sexology, speech and voice therapy, and other related fields. Well, I think that kind of covers the whole medical field, doesn't it? I'm not sure what voice therapy has to do with any of this. I'm not sure what anthropology really has to do with it, or sociology, or family studies. Not really sure. Speech therapy, not sure what it has to do with it. But you see how, again, we have a spider web. We talked about that with the UN. We have the spider web going on, and they're cross-pollinating again across all kinds of stuff.
Mental reconditioning.
Yeah, mental reconditioning, social engineering. Yes, bingo. Thanks, Josh. It goes on to say WPATH provides opportunities for professionals from various subspecialties to communicate with each other in the context of research and treatment of gender dysphoria, including sponsoring biennial scientific symposia. Now, symposiums, you have to be invited to attend them. Do you think they're going to invite people who don't support them to attend their symposium? Absolutely not. There's that. Back to the fact that they pick and choose who they want to be part of this, and they ignore the rest. WPATH publishes the Standards of Care and Ethical Guidelines, which articulate a professional consensus about the psychiatric, psychological, medical, and surgical management of gender dysphoria, and help professionals understand the parameters within which they may offer assistance to those with these conditions. Surgical consensus by whom? Remember, I told you before, I keep saying this too, it's never the what you have to be concerned about, it's usually the how. This plays into that because they are making claims and not telling us the details behind the claims, right? Let's go to the next slide. This is the ethical guidelines for professionals. It says WPATH has established international accepted standards of care for the treatment of individuals with gender dysphoria. These internationally accepted guidelines are designed to promote the health and welfare of transgender, transsexual, and gender variant persons in all cultural settings. The standards of care are updated and revised as new scientific information becomes available. Again, there is nothing mentioned about detransitioners. I want to point out to you, call your attention to the fact that they, in quotes, said, as new scientific information becomes available, unquote. One thing you have to know about science is it's always changing. We're always learning new things that we didn't know before. So the sad part about this is it's so new in the process that all of the data hasn't come out yet. All of the information hasn't been published yet. We don't know what the long-term effects are yet because there hasn't been enough time passing for a long-term study. I find it interesting that they even call that out here. They know that. It's not like they're dumb. They know that. Did you know that George Soros money funds WPATH? They're the biggest donation foundation to WPATH that there is. If you know anything about George Soros, that should answer a lot of questions for you. I'm going to move on to talk about SOC 8, so the Standard of Care 8. On page S43, Chapter 6, Adolescence. I'm just going to read an excerpt from it. It says, quote, in more recent years, there has been a sharp increase in the number of adolescents requesting gender care. These studies suggest gender diversity in youth should no longer be viewed as rare. That last part is the part that I want to call your attention to. Should no longer be viewed as rare. We talked about in part 1 the increase in people claiming to be transgender and presenting at gender clinics or healthcare professionals with that idea. It's doubling, guys, every year now. It's doubling. So, yeah, it should no longer be viewed as rare. Now, let's break that down and think about why. Why is it no longer considered rare? Is it catching? Is it contagious? Like Biden's faux pas.
Keep it away from me.
I mean, what's causing that? Do you think it could be the push in social media and media and the school systems and the government in exposure to this in order to desensitize us to it and normalize it? Do you think that could be it? Do you think it could go back to those communist goals we talked about? We'll leave that with you. GenSpect. So GenSpect I talked about last time, I believe. GenSpect is an organization, and I love them, that works to basically dispel the myths that are out there around gender transition. And they do it through detransition stories. They do it through studies. They actually do studies. The hosts are Sasha Ayad. She's a therapist for gender dysphoric adolescents. And Stella O'Malley, who's a psychotherapist in Ireland. And there's a video that I watched called WPATH's Bizarre 8th Standards of Care. Because again, I want objective viewpoints. I want to know what WPATH is saying, but I also want to know what their opposition is saying. And then I look into it, I research it, and I come out with a conclusion, right? I think that's the wise thing to do. So you can find it on YouTube. The link will be below, but I'm just going to give you some highlights. So out of that video, here's what some of the highlights are. SOC 8 has the feel of a shopping list of surgical interventions. That's what the experts are saying on GenSpect. Almost all of the minimum age requirements were missing from SOC 8. So what they did is, just so you know, they did a comparison between SOC 6, SOC 7, and SOC 8. And so they noticed some differences between 7 and 8. So that's one of them. Almost all the minimum age requirements were taken out of SOC 8. So there is no minimum age for trans care. They also said the language is, quote, lawyer language because it's vague enough for no one to be held responsible. Isn't that typical? The next thing they noticed was the document is more about political will than clinical care. Many items are categorized under gender but are truly body modifications, and that makes a lot of sense to me. Another thing they said was many website references cited in the document include unsavory information. And you'll find that like the references that people put out or organizations put out, they count on you not looking at them. And when you do, you'll find, that doesn't really make sense, or that doesn't seem like it would be a good thing. And that's what they're saying about the website references that were cited. Another thing they said was detransitioners are badly depicted in SOC 8, and the definition of a detransitioner is abhorrent. There's another video by GenSpect about leaked WPATH files. So what happened was Michael Schellenberger, who is a very prominent research guy, journalist kind of person, he started an organization, like a foundation, and he was sent leaked WPATH files from various different sources. And so he published them in a PDF, which you'll also find the link to that below in the description. So make sure you check that out. So he was sent all these sources of files that were internally disseminated at WPATH that different people sent him, and he compiled them. And then Mia Hughes works for him, and she actually wrote a report to accompany the leaked files. So we're going to take a look at a GenSpect video. It is with Mia. And Dr. Carrie Mendoza, who is the director of Fair in Medicine, that works to combat the politicization in medicine. Sorry, politicization. I can't say it. Politicization. Well, whatever. You know what I mean. So let's start the video interview with them.
I would say WPATH are integral to anything if you want to know about gender or transition in ever, really. You know what I mean? Because before WPATH, they were called the HBIGDA, which was the Harriet Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association. And they started as this fringe group in 1978. And I can go through, you know, how they changed. But ultimately, they're the HQ of medical transition.
So she's talking about the headquarters of medical transition being WPATH. She's talking about the Harry Benjamin, whatever, blah, 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 which sounds a little risque to me if you think about it. But whatever, that organization failed. And so then, and she speaks about this in another video. So they actually failed, and then they ended up, I think 3 years later, rebranding with the new name. And I find it so interesting how these organizations can basically self-attest that they're the experts and people just go along with it. I don't understand how they are esteemed as experts. They're a cohort of physicians and psychotherapists and stuff that, you know, meet together and come up with standards of care. But what makes them better than a doctor cohort that disagrees with what they're doing? Why is everybody, you know, gravitating towards WPATH as the experts? They just self-attested to it. Interesting. Let's go with the next part, please.
Of WPATH in and around 2007 or so. Then 2012, they had Standards of Care 7, and by then they were starting to become a very ideological organization, I would believe. And certainly Standards of Care 7 and Standards of Care 8, which came out in 2022, they both kind of deviate from what is a standards of care. Up until then, they were following the criteria. Then they were just doing their own thing, really. And so in Standards of Care 7, which is 2012, they brought out like this idea that, you know, that there was an affirmative model, and counselors and psychotherapists, they weren't offering a valuable therapeutic process anymore. What they were offering instead was a facilitation to medical transition.
Yeah, so what she's saying there is up until SOC 8, so Standards of Care 6, SOC 6, there was therapy involved for people who were going through gender dysphoria or gender confusion. In SOC 7, they took it out, and they started with the affirmative model. So gender affirmation theory, push them through. Don't question it. Don't upset them. Just push it through. Let's look at the next section.
They revealed their Standards of Care 8, which is an extraordinary document. And you and I have talked about it, Sasha, but it has, you know, a unique identity chapter. It has a chapter on non-binaries. It doesn't give very much credence to the detransition story, and instead reframes it as a gender journey. It took out the ethics chapter, and it also removed any word of experimental, arguably, so that that people would be covered with their health insurance. So it feels that Standards of Care 8 had really, really completely been overtaken by activists. And then a year or two later, the WPATH files basically revealed the internal conversations, and you realize this is an ideological organization that's not professional, it's not medical, and it's not scientific.
Yeah, that's such a good point. They also removed any age limits for interventions, and they explicitly said the reason that they've written the standards of care the way they did is so that insurance will cover things and so doctors won't get sued.
Did you catch that? I mean, this is all about the money, essentially. They're validating right there that these are just activists that run WPATH. They've just been reduced down to activism. There's no mention of detransition except for a gender journey. I'm pretty sure they're using that gender journey term for detransitioning because detransitioning is a final thing typically, and they don't want it to be final. They don't want to take away from the money that could be made through transitioning or the push to move our youth towards transitioning. They don't want to take away from that. So they don't want to accept that when people detrans, they're done. There were many other changes too, but those are the big ones that stood out to me. Let's look at the last clip on this.
So one of the things I found really shocking is that even when patients have very serious comorbidities, very serious psychiatric illness that would make it obviously impossible for them to consent, physicians within these WPATH conversations are being pressured by their colleagues to go ahead and prescribe the hormones, go ahead and do the surgeries. So, for example, one conversation was about a patient that has dissociative identity disorder. This means the patient believes that he or she has multiple personalities. And so there's this really bizarre conversation happening within this group where the physician is like, my patient has multiple personalities. How do I get consent for HRT if one personality is at the forefront, the altar versus the other? And there are people having a conversation as though this is completely sane and legitimate, explaining, well, you just have to interview all the personalities and get consent from all of them so that you don't end up getting kind of sued after if one of the personalities decides that, like,
key point. So you don't get sued, make sure you get consent from all the alters. It just felt like such a cynical way of dealing with either somebody who's extremely vulnerable, who has all this, as well as, dissociative identity disorder. It's highly controversial anyway. It reminds us very quickly of multiple personality scandal that happened and the repressed memory and stuff like that. So you really feel you're in almost cuckoo land. Like, it really does feel like a crazy piece of conversation where they're talking about getting consent from all the personalities. And I know I saw you were giggling there, Carrie. Every time we read it, it's like, how is this in 2024 considered a scientific, medical, serious, clinical conversation?
I just want to laugh every time I watch that, but they're absolutely right. In the leaked WPATH files, there are files that show those conversations going back and forth. Again, to their point, what scientific method is this? It's not a scientific method. The whole point is not to get sued. That's it. I highly encourage you to check out the resources below in the description. Go look at those leaked files. At least look at those and read through them because they're going to be very enlightening to you. They are email conversations back and forth between people at WPATH. One doctor, I recognize the name of her. She's very prominent in the field. I just think you should educate yourself about this. And even if you're not dealing with anything with transitioning or detransitioning right now, make sure you share this content with other people because whether you're dealing with it directly or not, it is prevalent in our society. And you're going to come across younger people who are struggling with this. I guarantee it. It's everywhere, everywhere. So how do we fight it? We talked about this in the last episode, but I'll repeat it. Even the left is waking up. Many countries in Europe are pulling back against this. They're putting laws in place that they have to actually provide, imagine that, therapy for these people before they actually rush them into these transition methodologies and therapies. So that's good news. And then there's also more and more resources available to people who are considering detransitioning or who have detransitioned as support. Here's just a few. The first one I'm going to talk about, let's put that slide up, slide 7, is a leftist organization, but they're waking up too to the tragedies that are going on against our youth. It's called LGBT Courage Coalition, and they're on Substack. And then slide 8 is Sex Change Regret. That's a website. All these links will be below. Sex Change Regret we talked about on the last episode, and there's thousands of members or visitors, actually over 2 million visitors to that site so far. So that tells you there's definitely an interest in it. Slide 9 is beyondtrans.org. They are actually part of GenSpect. And so that's a really good resource. And then slide 10, there's therapyfirst.org. And they're also a good resource. So again, if you like the content, you can find us on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, anywhere you get your podcasts. I also want to encourage you to go to revolverbroadcasting.com. We do have a contact us form. If you have any questions or comments that you'd like to send through that route, feel free to do that. And also check out all the other shows on Revolver. There's some really good ones you're going to want to see. And again, make sure that you're subscribed so you get notified every time we push a show out. We try to do it weekly right now. So make sure you're subscribed on whatever application you're watching on. And follow and like and post comments, because that helps us push up in the algorithm so more people can see the content. Post comments, questions, make sure you hit the notification bell so that you can make sure you're getting all the content that we provide. And with that, I will bid you adieu until next time.